The art gallery stood on a quiet corner of the city, its minimalist exterior belying the wealth and prestige of the pieces it displayed within. The polished glass windows offered glimpses of the finest contemporary art, attracting the city's elite, wealthy art collectors, and critics who roamed its halls with smug smiles and shallow glances. Inside, the air was crisp with a mix of old wood and fresh paint, and the soft murmur of voices seemed to float like a low hum, barely disturbing the quiet reverence the art commanded. Behind the reception desk stood a young man, eager and full of ambition. His name was Simon Westbrook, and he had opened this gallery with one goal in mind: to curate the next big wave of artists. He wanted to be the one to discover the next Picasso or Van Gogh, to stake his claim in the art world before the critics and the collectors did. Simon was sharp, intelligent, and oh so convinced that he could distinguish genius from mediocrity with ease. On that particular day, the gallery had just taken in a new batch of submissions. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the gallery only half filled with a few local art enthusiasts and collectors who seemed to be searching for something that would catch their eye. Simon was preparing for an upcoming exhibit, flipping through the portfolio of an artist who had just walked in. The man was older, with deep-set eyes and a weathered face. He wore a large, unkempt coat that gave off the faint smell of the streets and carried a canvas under his arm. He approached Simon at the front desk, holding the canvas out for him to see. "Good afternoon," the artist said, his voice rough but calm. "I have some work I'd like you to look at." Simon glanced up at him with a faint smirk, his eyes scanning the artist from head to toe. The artist looked the part of someone who wasn't well off. His tattered clothes and scruffy beard were enough to make Simon roll his eyes internally. He was used to seeing young and fresh talent in pristine suits or trendy, edgy outfits, but this man didn't fit that mold. He was older, and there was a certain raggedness about him that made Simon wary of what he might be walking into. Still, Simon put on a polite face, curious to see what the man had to offer. "What kind of work do you have?" he asked, trying to sound courteous while hiding his growing impatience. The artist, with a slight, almost knowing smile, placed the canvas on the counter between them. It was a piece of abstract art, swirls of deep blues and purples, streaks of gold and silver, a textured surface that seemed to be alive with movement. It wasn't the kind of art Simon was used to seeing. It didn't conform to the trendy, minimalistic aesthetic that had become popular among the well-heeled collectors who passed through the gallery. But it had something. There was emotion, rawness, and passion hidden within those colors. Simon looked at it for only a moment before he let out a small, dismissive chuckle. "Well, that's interesting," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He could already tell it wasn't the kind of thing that would bring in the right clientele. The gallery's reputation was built on modern, polished works, pieces that looked good in the homes of corporate CEOs, something to spark conversation over dinner parties, not something with the grit and intensity of this painting. The artist, however, seemed unfazed by Simon's apparent disinterest. He stood quietly, his eyes not leaving the canvas. "I've poured my soul into this work," the artist said simply. "I've lived through pain, hardship, and loss. This piece is a reflection of what I've gone through." Simon raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He could feel the awkwardness creeping into the air between them. To Simon, this was the art of someone trying too hard to be deep. The man's story might be tragic, but that didn't matter in the art world. What mattered was how marketable the piece was, and this one didn't fit the bill. It was messy, chaotic even. Not to mention, the artist didn't look like he had much going for him. The whole situation screamed desperation. In Simon's eyes, this wasn't a discovery, it was a dead end. "Look, I'm not sure this is quite the right fit for our gallery," Simon said, leaning over the counter with a practiced smile. He placed his hands firmly on the desk and glanced down at the canvas with feigned disinterest. "It's a bit raw, don't you think? Not really the kind of work that would appeal to our collectors. People want something a little more refined. You know? Something with a little more polish." The artist's eyes darkened slightly, but he said nothing, merely nodding in understanding. Simon continued, "I could offer you a small price for the piece if you'd like to sell." It's not exactly what we're looking for, but we can give you something for it. He casually scribbled a number on a piece of paper, a pittance, just enough to make the artist leave without feeling entirely dismissed. It was an offer Simon was certain would send the man on his way, too proud to accept the insult, but without options. The artist took the paper in his hand and folded it neatly. He didn't even look at the number. Instead, his eyes met Simon's with quiet intensity. "You don't know what you have here," he said, his voice soft but firm. "This piece will be worth more than you could ever imagine. But it's not for you." He paused, as if letting his words sink in. "One day, you'll regret this moment." Simon chuckled nervously, trying to mask his discomfort. "All right, well, good luck with your work. I'm sure you'll find someone who appreciates it more." He waved his hand dismissively, signaling the end of their conversation. The artist turned and walked out of the gallery, the door chiming behind him. Simon watched him go with a satisfied smile, already thinking of the next, more polished artist he'd have to meet that afternoon. He couldn't fathom that there was more to this encounter than he could see. But the homeless artist, walking down the street, carried with him the quiet knowledge that his art, his soul, was worth far more than the gallery owner could ever understand. He wasn't bitter. He was patient. And one day, Simon Westbrook would realize the mistake he had just made weeks past since the encounter in the gallery. Simon Westbrook, still basking in the confidence of his successful young career, had mostly forgotten about the homeless man with the chaotic painting. He had moved on to bigger names, people with polished resumes and portfolios filled with immaculate works of art. As the gallery owner prepared for an upcoming show, he didn't give much thought to the man or his unrefined piece. After all, he had dismissed it, it was forgotten, buried beneath the new wave of art he was pursuing. Meanwhile, the homeless artist had quietly slipped back into the world from which he came, no longer visible in the polished circles of the city, but still carrying his immense talent. He had never intended for his art to be sold for scraps or to be dismissed by those who failed to see its worth. Instead, he had his own plan. A plan to reveal the world to the true value of his work, not through the doorways of galleries or shows where shallow perceptions dominated, but through more hidden channels that truly respected the essence of his creations. The artist, whose name was Asher Monroe, had long since left his days on the streets behind. Despite his ragged appearance that day in Simon's gallery, he was no stranger to the art world. Asher had been a recognized name in private circles, his works often fetching millions in secretive auctions held in obscure parts of the world. He was a phantom figure, a myth to most. His true identity was cloaked in secrecy, and even those who owned his works were rarely aware of the man behind the art. Asher had chosen to remain an enigma, not out of arrogance, but because he believed that true art should speak for itself, without the need for fame, fortune, or public validation. His paintings, raw and visceral, had resonated with a select group of buyers who cherished his work for its authenticity, for the deep emotion that poured from every stroke. And then came the gala, a grand event in the heart of the city, where the world's wealthiest art collectors gathered to view and bid on exclusive pieces. It was a glittering occasion, filled with ornate chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a room full of glittering jewels and designer suits. Art collectors, curators, and artists alike milled about, sipping champagne and discussing pieces in hushed voices, as they admired the works on display. Simon Westbrook stood in the center of the crowd, wearing a freshly tailored suit, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. He had arranged to bring a few select pieces from his gallery, confident that they would fetch astronomical prices. It was his moment to shine, a night that would solidify his reputation as one of the top gallery owners in the city. He had no idea that the event would soon shatter his illusions of the art world. As the night unfolded, one particular piece began to attract the attention of everyone in the room. It was a bold and striking work, an abstract painting, swirling with hues of deep reds, blues, and golds. The strokes seemed to leap off the canvas, creating an illusion of movement, of energy trapped in color. It was chaotic, untamed, and beautiful. In a sea of curated, refined art, it stood out like a beacon. Simon, intrigued, made his way toward the painting, eager to know who the artist was. He had never seen anything quite like it. The vibrant, almost dangerous intensity of the piece was unlike anything he had encountered. As he approached, a quiet voice behind him spoke. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Simon turned to face a man standing just behind him, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that blended into the shadows of the room. His face was partially obscured by a fedora, and his expression remained unreadable. It was impossible to tell his age. His features were obscured in such a way that he seemed like a mere shadow among the opulent backdrop. But his words were confident, carrying a certain depth that caught Simon off guard. "Who's the artist?" Simon asked, unable to tear his eyes away from the painting. The man's lips curled slightly, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Ah, that's Asher Monroe." Simon felt a jolt of recognition, though he quickly pushed it aside. He had heard rumors of Asher Monroe, the reclusive genius whose work sold for astronomical sums in private auctions, whose name was spoken in reverence among elite collectors. But Simon had never expected to see a piece by Monroe in such a public space. Asher was a myth, a ghost. His identity was known only to a select few. "Monroe?" Simon echoed, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "But he doesn't exhibit publicly, does he?" The man raised an eyebrow. "He doesn't need to. His works are sold in private auctions, for millions. But this one," he gestured to the painting, "this one is about to make history. His pieces always do." Simon felt his pulse quicken as he listened. Asher Monroe, the very artist he had dismissed in his gallery weeks before. The very artist whose chaotic, raw painting he had been so quick to discard as unrefined. His mind began to spin, the image of the piece he had rejected flashing before his eyes. He felt a surge of embarrassment, guilt gnawing at him. How could he have been so wrong? As the auction began, Simon found himself unable to focus on anything else. The bidding started slow, but quickly escalated. Whispers circulated through the room as the price climbed higher, with multiple collectors bidding fiercely for the painting. Simon's heart raced with disbelief as he watched the figure on the podium raise the price, each increment staggering, far beyond what he could have ever imagined. By the time the auctioneer brought the hammer down, the painting had sold for a jaw-dropping $30 million, an amount that left the entire room in stunned silence. Simon stood frozen, his mouth dry as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had dismissed the work of a genius, a man whose creations were now being celebrated on a global scale. And then, amidst the applause, the man in the dark suit, the one who had spoken to Simon, stepped forward, his fedora tipping back to reveal his face. As he removed his hat, the room fell into a stunned hush. It was Asher Monroe, the artist himself, standing before them all, his face calm and unreadable, as if he were simply walking through another day. The crowd erupted into murmurs of awe and excitement, unsure of how they had missed him until now. Asher smiled, but it was not a smile of arrogance or pride. It was the smile of someone who had known all along that the world would eventually recognize the value of his work. It was the smile of someone who had been patient, who had waited for this moment when his genius would no longer be hidden in the shadows. Simon stood, his heart racing, as the weight of the truth settled over him like a cold, crushing tide. The artist he had mocked, dismissed, even, was standing before him, and his work was worth more than Simon could ever have imagined. Asher Monroe, the elusive artist, had just taken his place in history. And Simon Westbrook, the once confident gallery owner, would never forget the lesson that night had taught him, that genius could never be contained, and it would always rise to be seen. The days following the gala had been a blur for Simon Westbrook. The glittering auction, the shock of the painting's staggering price, and the revelation of Asher Monroe's true identity all seemed like fragments of a dream, each piece slipping from his grasp with the passage of time. He had tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence, that the artist's success didn't reflect poorly on him, that the art world was fickle, and that he had made the right decisions for his gallery's future. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the gnawing feeling of regret clung to him like a shadow. It started with a subtle whisper, something in the back of his mind that couldn't be shaken. He couldn't stop thinking about that piece. The bold, chaotic painting that Asher Monroe had shown him. He had seen its potential, but he had been too quick to judge. The words the artist had spoken to him in the gallery echoed in his mind, "You don't know what you have here. One day, you'll regret this moment." Simon had laughed it off at the time, dismissing the man as just another struggling artist. But now, after seeing the millions that painting had fetched at the auction, Simon couldn't ignore the truth anymore. "I made a huge mistake." He hadn't been the only one who had missed the value of Monroe's art, far from it. The entire gallery world had failed to recognize his genius until now, and the art market had long been plagued by the arrogance of collectors and critics who believed they could predict what would rise and fall in value. But Simon's mistake felt personal. He had been given a chance, an opportunity to discover something extraordinary, and he had dismissed it out of hand. Worse, he had insulted the artist in the process, reducing his art to a mere commodity, to be pawned for pocket change. As Simon sat in his office the next morning, sipping his coffee in an attempt to calm his racing thoughts, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling of guilt that had taken root in his chest. His phone sat on the desk before him, but it felt like an object of betrayal. He had no idea how to fix the mess he had made. He knew nothing about Asher Monroe's life, his history, his influences, or even the true nature of his artistic process. The artist's name had only ever been a whisper, and now that whisper had become a deafening roar. There were no public records about him, no interviews, no easy way to track him down. He had disappeared into the shadows, leaving no trace except for his work, which was now fetching millions. Where do I even start? Simon thought about how Asher had looked at him in the gallery, how calm and composed the artist had been despite the insult Simon had unknowingly thrown at him. That moment, that quiet intensity, had stayed with him in the days since. There was a wisdom to Asher, a knowing look in his eyes that suggested he understood exactly how things would unfold. It was as though Asher had always known his art would be discovered on his own terms, not through the pretensions of galleries and critics, but through its raw, undeniable power. The more Simon thought about it, the more he realized that Asher wasn't just any artist. He was someone who had purposefully stayed out of the spotlight, someone who had chosen to let his art speak for itself without the need for the commercial machine of galleries to carry him. Simon's own role in this process had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in the artist's greater journey. But even so, Simon felt like there was a chance to make things right. He had to find Asher. He had to find a way to apologize and make amends. If Asher was truly the genius that the world was now recognizing him to be, Simon's gallery could still play a role in his future. There had to be a way to convince Asher that he could be a part of that world, a world where he would receive the recognition he deserved, where his art would not only be appreciated but celebrated. Simon began his search with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He combed through every art auction, every high-end collector's list, every online database for any hint of Asher's past or future works. He spent hours digging through articles, interviews, and obscure references to Asher's paintings. But it was all in vain. Asher had kept his identity a secret for so long that it was almost as if he had never existed outside the canvas. Simon enlisted the help of several high-profile art agents, all of whom had connections to the most elusive buyers and sellers. He reached out to everyone he knew in the art world, hoping for a lead, any lead. But each time he tried, he hit a dead end. The more he tried to dig into Asher's past, the more he realized just how little he actually knew about the artist. There were no interviews. There were no press releases. Asher Monroe had carefully crafted his image as a recluse, as a ghost who existed only through his art. Still, Simon wasn't willing to give up. He began reaching out to wealthy collectors, some of whom he had worked with in the past, hoping they might be able to offer some insight. He begged for any details about Asher, his background, where he lived, or even where he might be exhibiting his work next. But it was like chasing shadows. One afternoon, after hours of fruitless searching, Simon found himself pacing around his office, frustrated and exhausted. He had reached out to everyone he knew, and yet he still couldn't find a way to contact Asher Monroe. It felt like a dead end. But then, his mind flitted back to that night at the gala, the way Asher had stood in the shadows, silent and composed, with an air of quiet authority. There was something about the way he had moved, the way he had spoken, that suggested he wasn't just an artist. He was someone who had control, someone who operated on his own terms. Suddenly, Simon had an idea. If he couldn't find Asher in the usual places, through auction houses, collectors, or galleries, maybe the best way to reach him was through the most exclusive circle of all, the buyers themselves. These were the people who had snapped up Asher's works for millions, the ones who had the deepest connection to the art. If anyone knew how to find him, it would be them. Simon knew this was his last chance. Desperation crept into his veins as he placed another call, this time to an old contact, a renowned collector known for his vast private art collection. Simon's heart pounded as the phone rang, hoping, praying that this time would be different. "Hello," came the voice on the other end. "It's Simon Westbrook," Simon said quickly, barely able to contain the urgency in his voice. "I need your help. It's about Asher Monroe. Do you know where I can find him? Please, this is important." There was a long pause on the line before the collector's voice came back, low and contemplative. "Ah, Monroe. I thought you'd come around eventually. Tell you what, I'll see what I can do. But if you really want to get in touch with him, you'll need to come to the next private auction. That's where he operates. And I'll warn you, he's not the easiest to find, and he certainly won't come to you. You'll have to prove yourself." Simon exhaled in relief, feeling a flicker of hope. He was getting closer. Finally, he was getting closer to finding the artist, to righting the wrong he had made. And so, with renewed determination, Simon prepared for the next auction. He knew that if he could only meet Asher in person, he might still have a chance to make things right. But what he didn't know was just how deeply his life, and the future of his gallery, was about to change. It had been nearly a month since Simon Westbrook's frantic search for Asher Monroe had begun, and he had spent the last few days preparing for the event that could redeem his entire career. The private auction had led him to a contact who had promised to help him get a foot in the door with Asher, but Simon knew that no matter how many people he reached out to, the final decision on how to proceed rested solely in Asher's hands. Simon's gallery, now filled with more popular, safe pieces from contemporary artists, had been going through the motions. The elite clientele came and went, trading in their extravagant tastes for the next fashionable piece, but Simon couldn't shake the feeling that his heart wasn't in it anymore. His thoughts often drifted back to the night of the gala, to that moment when he had watched Asher's work sell for millions. He had seen the artist's true brilliance too late, and that regret haunted him more than anything else. But that morning, as he walked through the gallery's doors, something was different. The air in the gallery felt charged, as though something was about to shift. He couldn't explain it, but there was a palpable change, an almost electric tension in the space that set his nerves on edge. The day's show was set to open in a few hours, but there was something nagging at Simon. A feeling of anticipation, but also unease. As Simon wandered through the space, checking the positioning of various works and ensuring everything was ready for the show, he noticed a figure standing near the back of the gallery. At first, he assumed it was just one of the early visitors, perhaps a potential buyer or a critic. But then his heart skipped a beat. There was something so familiar about the person standing there, their posture exuding a quiet confidence that Simon couldn't ignore. It wasn't until the figure turned slightly, just enough for Simon to see the sharp, calculating gaze, that everything clicked into place. Asher Monroe was standing in his gallery. He was different this time. No longer dressed in the ragged clothes of a man struggling on the streets, Asher now wore an elegant suit that hinted at sophistication, a soft gray jacket draped over his shoulders with the perfect balance of formality and ease. His dark eyes, once filled with a quiet patience, now shimmered with purpose and knowledge. The transformation was stunning, but it was the unmistakable presence that Asher exuded that struck Simon the hardest. He wasn't just an artist now, he was a force to be reckoned with. Simon froze, staring at the man who had once been nothing more than an unpolished unknown in his eyes. He had assumed Asher was a failure, a transient artist with little to offer. But now, here he stood in the very space where Simon had mocked him, his work now the subject of worldwide adoration. Asher didn't look angry, or vindictive, or even bitter. He looked calm, peaceful, as if he had been preparing for this moment all along. Simon's mouth went dry as he stepped forward, unsure of how to approach the artist. He had been bracing for a confrontation, perhaps an apology demanded, or a confrontation full of righteous anger. But Asher's composure rendered him speechless. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in on Simon, pushing him closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The man he had so thoughtlessly dismissed was now standing in front of him as a titan of the art world, and Simon knew there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. Asher took a few steps forward, his eyes locking with Simon's in a way that felt like a quiet judgment, but without malice. He approached the counter, where Simon stood frozen, and paused for a moment. Then, in a voice that was calm and even, Asher spoke. "Hello, Simon. It's good to see you again." Simon's breath caught in his chest, the recognition of the voice bringing everything crashing down around him. He looked at Asher, his mind racing to process what was happening, but the words failed him. He had been so wrong. So utterly and completely wrong. "I see you've been doing well for yourself," Asher continued, a trace of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The gallery's doing great. But you haven't forgotten about me, have you? After all, I did offer you the chance to work with me once. I thought you'd be more interested in a piece like mine, especially considering your reputation for finding new talent." Simon swallowed hard, still unable to form a coherent thought. His face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and regret. He had been so quick to judge, so confident in his own understanding of art. And now, standing in front of him, was the very artist he had dismissed, now a name that commanded respect and admiration. Asher paused, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "I'm sure you've realized by now that I'm not the kind of artist who needs your help," he said, his tone still measured but now tinged with a quiet authority. "But I didn't come here to gloat, Simon. I didn't come here to rub my success in your face. No, I came here because I think you and I can do something special together." Simon blinked, his mind trying to catch up to the words. What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice finally coming to life, but weak with uncertainty. Asher smiled, but it was a smile that held no trace of vindictiveness. It was a smile that spoke of wisdom, of someone who had been through the fire and emerged unscathed. "I want to offer you a chance to make things right," he said softly. "But not just for you, for both of us. I want to sell my future pieces to this gallery, exclusively. But I want you to change the way you do business. I want you to support the artists, not just profit from them. If you can do that, we can work together. If not, then we can both go our separate ways. It's up to you." Simon felt his heart race. This was it. The moment of reckoning. He had been given a second chance, and Asher Monroe was offering him an opportunity he couldn't afford to pass up. I agree," Simon said, the words tumbling out before he had time to think. "I'll change. I'll do whatever it takes to make this work. I understand now. I've been so wrong. You've taught me that." Asher nodded once, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good. Then we have an understanding." And with that, the deal was struck. Simon's life, and the future of his gallery, would never be the same. They would work together, not just as gallery owner and artist, but as partners, each bringing their unique perspective to the table. Simon would learn to truly support his artists, to recognize their value and their worth. And in turn, Asher would provide his art to a place where it would be respected and celebrated for what it was, an expression of his soul, untainted by the cold grasp of commerce. Simon stood in his gallery, looking out at the now empty space. The deal with Asher was done, and the new direction for the gallery was set. The partnership between them was more than just about art, it was about mutual respect, about understanding the true essence of creation, and about building something more than just a business. In the weeks that followed, Simon transformed his gallery into a place that truly celebrated the artist, a place where their work was given the space and the attention it deserved. Gone were the days of looking for the next hot commodity. Instead, Simon focused on cultivating a genuine connection with the artists, offering them support and encouragement, helping them to grow without the pressure of conforming to market trends. As for Asher, his works became the centerpiece of the gallery, and each new piece he created was showcased with reverence. The collaboration between the two men brought a new level of success and recognition to both, but more importantly, it changed the dynamics of the entire art scene in their town. The gallery became a beacon for up-and-coming artists who knew that here they would find a place where their work was truly valued. The art world was never the same after that. Simon's gallery, once a place of shallow commercialism, became a cornerstone of artistic integrity, and Asher Monroe's legacy grew stronger with each new work. Together, they had created a space where art could thrive, uncompromised and full of life. And in the end, both Simon and Asher knew that their partnership wasn't just about business. It was a testament to the power of humility, of growth, and of the undeniable bond that exists between art and those who have the courage to see it for what it truly is.